Hello everyone, Phil here. How's it going? I hope well. So last video I mentioned how oftentimes the fuel economy figures of hybrid cars are wildly unreliable and overstated, but that I also needed to do some digging before being able to say anything more about that topic. Well, I have done my homeworks now, and it turns out there's quite a lot to unpack. Sit tight, relax, grab a drink, and let's see how one type of hybrid car gives a bad name to hybrid cars in general, and how, for once, car manufacturers might not be the main culprit. Perhaps. You'll see. So, there are three main types of hybrid vehicles on the market right now. First one being plug-in hybrids, or PHEVs, here's the acronym. Then we have full hybrids and mild hybrids. The main difference between the first two is that the former has a battery that can be charged by both the car's engine and by using an independent external charger, while in the latter, the battery can't be charged outside of the main engine and is thus recharged only by the car's engine, which acts as a generator. Then mild hybrids are kind of a scaled down version of full hybrids, if I can say so, in which the starter motor, so the little electric motor that is used to start the car's engine, or another small electric engine, is used to give the car a slight boost in acceleration from a standstill, or for example to allow the car to turn the engine off while coasting without losing speed for some distance. But they can't properly accelerate the car on their own. At most they can help maintain a constant speed for a while. So if your car has got a start and stop system, thus it automatically powers off the engine at an intersection to save fuel, for example, think of mild hybrids as a slight upgrade of that. You don't just use the starter motor to turn the engine back on rapidly when it's time to set off, you also use it to start moving the car while the engine is being turned on. It is worth noting that sometimes cars with a start and stop system are referred to as micro hybrids, but that is quite misleading if you ask me, and there's no real electric propulsion in these cars. They can't be moved by electric power really, they're just turned on and off rapidly. Now, small disclaimer here, this is not meant to be a comprehensive guide to hybrid vehicles. There's plenty of people more qualified than me that can compile one. I just wanted to present you with a few examples that can show how you can mate an electric motor to a petrol engine to produce a hybrid result. As you can imagine, plug-in hybrids are the ones that feature the biggest batteries and can usually drive for tens of kilometers on electric power alone. This makes them incredibly fuel efficient, and they can also reach quite high speeds on electric power alone without even turning on the internal combustion engine, which is pretty cool if you ask me. Strictly speaking, a car doesn't have to be a plug-in hybrid to do so. Plug-in hybrids are technically a subtype of full hybrids, which are cars that can then be run on electricity, fuel, or both at the same time. Plug-in just refers to the way the battery can be recharged. But still, plug-in hybrids are the ones with the biggest batteries and the most powerful electric motors, so those are the ones that can usually go the farthest on electric power alone and the fastest as well. One good example of a plug-in hybrid vehicle is the Volvo XC40 plug-in hybrid, for which Volvo claims a fuel economy of upwards of 141 miles to the gallon, and also can reach speeds of up to 70 miles an hour on electric power alone. See the test linked in the description for actual evidence of that happening. And though in that test, I should stress that the tester only managed to get about 32 mpgs, more or less, of fuel economy, which is quite a lot less than what the manufacturer claims. Nevertheless, figures like this, especially about the overstatement of fuel economy of plug-in hybrids, are not uncommon. See all the other sources in the description for that. And it kind of got me thinking, why? Or better, how car manufacturers are allowed to publish such preposterous claims for fuel economy of these cars while knowing that those fuel economies are very, very hard to achieve. Also, maybe it's unrelated, Spoiler, it's not. But what's the point of reaching such high speeds on electric power alone? I mean, plug-in hybrids with a relatively small battery packs compared to full electric vehicles anyways, are not very powerful electric motors are supposed to be at the peak of their efficiency in sort of urban environments, while in extra-urban contexts, it's the engine that is supposed to be the main source of power. So, knowing this, what's the point of being able to reach speeds north of 70 miles an hour, 120 kph, if you're not in a country that uses these stupid measurement units, or sometimes even higher actually speeds? Now, I have my theories about this, but first I've got to introduce you to the data. So, these are the cars that we will look at. There are 17 in total, of which 6 are self-charging hybrids, and the rest, 11 thus, are plug-ins. The reason for the imbalance between the two classes is mostly due to the fact that I wanted to focus mostly on plug-in hybrids. The other cars are there mostly for comparison. I tried to select cars from different body styles, sizes, different price ranges, and different destinations of use. So we have from SUVs to saloon and estate cars, to hatchbacks, to also, hypercars? Well, yeah, those three might look a bit out of place, and indeed they actually are. But I decided to include them nevertheless, because one can't run on electric power alone, the Ferrari, and the other two can, the McLaren, the Porsche. But those two actually have very different claimed fuel economies, so it might be interesting to see why this is. All sources for fuel economies are in the description, and these are all European sources, bar one actually for the McLaren, which again is not very important as a data point, and they're mostly British journals, to be more precise. This will be important, so keep it in mind. We're using European sources. Also, one last note is that I've been using miles to the gallon, to be precise, imperial miles to the gallon, not US ones, as a measurement unit. And it might be weird to see a self-professed scientist using non-SI units. But the reason for this, though, is that of all possible measurement units, imperial MPGs are the smallest ones. Thus, they are the ones with the biggest relative oscillation from one car to the other. For example, a difference of 1 km per liter translates to a difference of 3 imperial miles to the gallon, more or less. Therefore, because we're looking at variations in the dataset, I would argue that the imperial MPG makes the most sense to use, because again, we can see the variations better. Also, on a side note, a commonly used measurement unit used for fuel economy, which is based on the SI, instead is liters per 100 kilometers. But the problem with this unit are 2 instead of 1. First is that, again, it's a relatively small measurement unit, so variations are harder to appreciate, but also, perhaps more importantly, a better fuel economy translates to a lower number in this unit of measurement, because it's liters used for 100 kilometers. So the less you use, the more economical your car is to run. And this can be counterintuitive, so again, we're going to stick to imperial MPGs for this round. But here's the conversion factory. So, these are the fuel economies claimed by the manufacturers compared to the fuel economies measured in the real world by testers. This line is the one-to-one line, thus the closer a car plots to it, the closer the claimed and real world fuel economies are to each other. One-to-one line meaning then that each point on that line equals to a point in which the measured fuel economy is identical to the claimed fuel economy. Now, it seems to me that our data are actually divided into 2 subgroups. They are not very homogeneous. One that is reasonably close to the one-to-one line, and one instead that is wildly off. The only points who could belong to either of those are those belonging to the McLaren P1 and the Ferrari LaFerrari, which one could argue is just due to the fact that the fuel economy figures of those cars are so low, compared to the others at least, that they plot just too close to the origin to really understand in which dataset they belong to. As you can see, but you probably already guessed, The distinction I've been banging on about earlier is the key to understand these two trends. Manufacturers tend to be relatively honest when it comes to self-charging hybrids, but instead they seem to be lying through their teeth when it comes to plug-in hybrids. The only one exception is this car up here, which is the Toyota Prius plug-in, which despite being a plug-in electric vehicle, plus quite close to the one-to-one line. The next best result in fuel economy measured in the real world comes from actually the self-charging variant of the Prius. So if we ignore the claimed MPGs for a moment and just focus on the fuel economy that we get in the real world, we can see that there is no appreciable difference between plug-in electric vehicles and more conventional hybrids, on average at least. The most important question actually when talking about the fuel economy of a hybrid car seems to be, is it a Toyota Prius or is it not? Which is quite silly, to be fair, but still, props to the Prius, I guess. Now, I have seen reports, mostly in the form of owners' comments, which you can find in the sources I've reported, about people indeed getting much higher fuel economies from some plug-in hybrids. And that actually is perfectly plausible. I have no reason to doubt it. When used for short, mid-length commutes in mostly urban environments, those cars are absolutely efficient, especially if the battery is charged from the grid and not by the engine. They will hardly turn the engine on in those contexts, and thus will get incredibly great fuel economies. But outside of those contexts, though, they don't seem to be faring much better compared to other hybrid cars. Well, take that away, actually. They are bloody the same, and some of those figures are quite unimpressive indeed. Look at the Volvo XC40, which we used an example a bit earlier. In a mixed driving test, again source in the description, it clocked around 32.4 miles to the gallon. A car like this will return a very similar fuel economy with a much older and bigger engine. And we're talking about a sports car here, so while it is very light, it wasn't really developed with fuel economy in mind, wasn't it? So, where does this discrepancy come from? Now, one big hint about why plug-in hybrids seem to be so much more efficient only on paper comes from the Toyota Prius plug-in I have mentioned earlier. You might notice that the source in the description, if you go actually look at it, is not exactly an impartial one. Well, on the contrary, it's Toyota itself, which you could argue again is not very reliable. But the real world figures about fuel economy that they report come from an average of Prius plug-in owners. So those are actually pretty reliable figures regardless of the source. But the key is the claimed figure there. If you look at the official EU homologation figures, in fact, the Prius plug-in is supposed to achieve 235 mpgs. So why the hell isn't Toyota using that figure, which is much better than what they actually use in their source? And also, where does it come from? Well, in a nutshell, the culprit is the WLTP cycle, which stands for Worldwide Harmonized Light Vehicle Test Procedure. What is it, you may ask? Well, it simply is the system used by the European Union to test the fuel economy, and thus the emission figures, by the way, of cars for sale in the EU. Basically, it's a static test, performed on a rolling road, or dyno if you're a car enthusiast, something like this, consisting of a series of repeated accelerations and decelerations, which last for about 30 minutes, or these many seconds, and this is more or less how it looks like. It corresponds to an equivalent distance of about 23 kilometers or 14 miles, and also the test gets up to a speed of 131.3 kilometers per hour, which is about 80 miles an hour and a bit. This test has been in place since the 1st of September 2019, so it's quite a recent thing, but it is pretty much just an update of the old NEDC, which is the New European Driving Cycle, which kind of looked as something similar really. It was a same principle. And it was in place for a while, this one, and the principle again remains kind of the same. To its credit, the WLTP cycle is more representative of modern driving habits than the previous one, but it isn't perfect still. Indeed, Toyota seems to be actively avoiding to use WLTP figures, specifically because how overly optimistic they seem to be. So, disclaimer here, this section will feature some hypotheses that I won't be able to prove beyond any reasonable doubt. As if the rest of the stuff I say is able to be proven that way. But jokes apart, take what I say with a grain of salt. It's just some food for thought, really. So these are the speeds that the plug-in hybrid cars can reach on electric power alone. Notice anything strange? Like, they all can get very close or above the top speed reached in the WLTP cycle. In addition, the maximum range that these cars can cover on electric power alone is supposedly just a bit higher, on average, than the total length of the WLTP cycle. Look at it, really. Now, the relatively sharp accelerations required by the WLTP cycle are sufficient to avoid for these cars to run on electric power alone during it, which is something at least, otherwise they just wouldn't give a fuel economy figure at all. But I can't shake the feeling that car manufacturers are developing engine maps that are excellent at acing the WLTP test, or the tests performed by the EPA in the US, for what matters. Those are also static tests performed on a dyno, whatever. But that do not perform nearly as well when driven by testers or just average people in the real world on real roads. To be fair, this is better than nothing. I mean, some people will definitely drive on some occasions, or on most occasions, in a way that closely resembles the WLTP test, explaining thus why sometimes those very high fuel economy figures are achieved on the road as well. Moreover, the WLTP cycle is effectively better at approximating fuel economy than the NEDC test that came before it. So, what do we make of all of this then? Well, for starters, we should be praising the one manufacturer that actively decides to ditch WLTP figures for their own plug-in hybrid, which is Toyota. Disclaimer, I don't own a Toyota. I used to own one, it was a great car, but right now, I'm not doing any commercial. As if any car manufacturer would pay me to, promote cars. As for one against the other, really, can we blame them for using the figures that our governing bodies use for official homologation? I mean, I think not really. It might be a bit cheeky, but the real problem is that the regulatory bodies at the moment are using tests that evidently are representative of the way these cars are used most of the time. Are there tests that could substitute this? Well, sure. Here's the picture of a car undergoing the RDE, or Real Drive Emission Test, which consists in, well, connecting the device called a PEMS, or a Portable Emission Measurement System, to the exhaust of a car and then driving it about for a while. One could say that this test won't be able to perfectly approximate the way each and every driver will use their own private car, and they will have a point, but nevertheless, it will definitely be more honest than what we see from the WLTP cycle. That is for sure. I mean, it is on the road, at least. Now, this is not just a rant about how much you end up spending at the petrol pump. In reality, fuel economy figures are directly tied to emissions from the cars we drive. So, here's a modest proposal. Seeing that pretty much all the fuel economies quoted in this as real-world MPGs measured by testers were actually measures by none others than the bloody cars themselves, which have just many ways to log these data, and they already do that. Why not mandate car manufacturers to actually collect those information whenever the cars are serviced, which again they are, and use them to produce fuel economy figures that effectively mirror the way these cars are used by the people who drive them every day? Now again, it won't be perfect, and of course all data will need to be kept free of any identifying information, though I suspect it wouldn't be hard to do that. And in the early life of each new model, these figures will not be available, or they might be based on older cars, thus not be very reliable. But I would argue that it's already miles ahead, no pun intended, from any test that could be performed in a lab, which is what we're using now. Until then though, yeah, well, be careful if you're planning to buy a plug-in hybrid. Depending on your driving style and necessities, you might find out that you spent quite a lot more than you would have on a non-plug-in hybrid car, only to get the same, if not a worse, fuel economy. Doesn't matter what magazines and salespeople sell you. That's really all for today. Rant over, fill out. Have a good one.
Well, we've made it. Thanks for watching once again. Main sources are just in the description this time, just easier that way.